Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, November 17th, and right before we started recording this, you were saying that you wanted to talk a little bit about Syria, so I'll let you just take it. Fill me
Okay.
in. What's going on?
Yeah, I have actually avoided looking at Syria for a while, and the reason is I just find the whole thing so depressing. You know, the fall of Assad and the takeover by the head choppers and Israel's incursions into Syria, everything about it just really depressed me. But of course I can't use that as an excuse. I need I to know what's going on there. So anyway, I made an effort recently and learned quite a bit. I guess I should thank, in particular, Vanessa Beale and Kevork Amassian. Kevork is actually Syrian. He's of Armenian descent, Armenian heritage. Vanessa Beale is somebody who lived in Syria for quite a while, and both of them have, extensive contacts within Syria. And what they said actually was pretty much was very consistent. So, um, anyway, yeah, we have al-Shara, formerly al-Jilani, right? And I expect that he's returned to Syria now, but he had that recent visit to Washington D.C., where he was celebrated, and a number of people have commented, of course, on the fact that here there's this terrorist, somebody who had a $10 million bounty on his head very recently, and now he's buddies with world leaders. Yeah. Now, there are terrorists who have come in from the cold and have become respected leaders. So this isn't entirely new in that sense. We have, in fact, let's say Jerry Adams, who used to be an Irish terrorist, a member of the IRA, the Irish Revolutionary Army, or we have probably the best known is, oh, I'm so sorry, how can I forget his name right now? This is embarrassing. I won't even go there. But anyway, we have, we've had terrorists have come in the cold and become respected members of the world community. This is not unusual. But I think this is exceptional. We can't say this is, this happens. Well, first of all, it's just the rapidity of it is quite stunning. But more than that, it's like, when we look at these other terrorists that were involved in armed struggles that, by and large, most people could understand and respect. If you're fighting for Irish independence, for example, that's many people in the world will say, okay, that's a cause that I understand. I can see why he did that. And if there were terrorist attacks, well, war is war. These kinds of things happen as part of armed struggle, and he was fighting for his cause, right? And then later, when these people take power. Well, it's not like they institute a terrorist regime, for example, in Ireland or anything like that. But this is different. We're talking about somebody, first of all, who was not engaged in a cause that anybody, other than, a few wild-eyed extremists considered worthy as any way justifiable. He was a head chopper. He was fighting for Al-Qaeda and ISIS. This was just a nihilistic, or I shouldn't say a nihilistic sect, it's not nihilistic, but, an extremist, extremely bloody sect that celebrates, bloodshed, and it aims to establish, a dictatorship of Sunni extremists. And that's what he has now. I mean, he's taken control a part of the country, and now his thugs, his army is roaming the country and carrying out ethnic cleansing and massacres. There's entire neighborhoods of Damascus that have been emptied, for example, and of course, we heard about the atrocities in the Northwest. If you're an Alawite, if you're a Christian, if you're a Shia, you're constantly vulnerable to attack by these people. And so in many cases, these Alawites are fleeing from the Sunni majority areas, to the minority areas. That's what's happening. So this really is exceptional. to have somebody like this in charge, to bring him in so rapidly and not, there's no conversion. He's there and he's now at the head of a Sunni state. And he is, maybe he's being a little bit careful about how he carries out his program, but he's carrying it out, or he's allowing the people beneath him to carry it out. So now we have
what the program is what, just persecuting to kill the Shias, Alawites,
yeah, to the very
Christians?
least, yeah, to kill some, to drive others away, and
To convert
above
the
all,
others?
to subjugate them. To if they're going to tolerate them, they have to be second or third class citizens. And that's just a huge difference from the Syria that existed under Assad. You say whatever you can say about Assad, there was peace between the sects. And that's what everybody says. It's just like that wasn't, you had friends who, if you were a Christian, you had many Alawite and Sunni and, Shia friends. And, that was just true. And the Druze, the Kurds, whatever, the ethnic groups and different sects, they did coexist peacefully. And that's something that Assad maintained. He was Alawite, but it wasn't, a cruel Alawite dictatorship or any attempt to force, the religion of the Alawites on the rest of them. That just did not exist.
Are these Sunni extremists, are they trying to convert the non-Sunni Muslims or just Sunni people?
In some cases, yeah.
Or is it conversion by basically at sword point, saying like
it does happen? Yeah, no, we've had videos of that kind of thing, attempts to do that, and if somebody refused to do, they get killed. That happens. That kind of thing does happen.
Where do these guys? Where do these guys come from? Are they Syrian?
A lot of them are a very large percentage of the HTS army. That took over and are now, roaming the part of the country that the al-Sharaa government now controls, actually are not Syrians. They're Chechens, they're Uyghurs, they're other foreigners. Some of
Central
them are
Asian
Syrians.
more, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
and they're ideological. They're there because they're ideological extremists. That's why they're there. And so they are, in a kind of a haphazard way are carrying out the program.
Do you think that like the CIA or I don't know, Mossad are helping facilitate the transportation of these extremists to Syria? Like how are these guys all getting there? Because I remember there were 11 or like a dozen Uyghurs that were arrested, I think in Malaysia, from flying from China to Malaysia, and they're on their way for jihad. And I remember the U.S. tried to make a little bit of a hullabaloo about, look, persecuting Uyghurs. And they're like, hey, whoa, this is not what you think it is. These are
right.
terrorists, extremists. So who's helping these people get around? I mean, I guess they can just buy their own ticket. They self-fund, or is there some larger organization behind it?
Well, my answer is I don't know. But there has been.
You think, right? What do you think? It's probably not all fully organic, right? There's probably some funding.
Well, they obviously get. Yeah, I'm sure they're getting help. Is that? Where is that coming from? It's quite possible that the CIA is involved. We know that the CIA was involved in Chechnya to a certain extent, so they do have those connections, and it is possible. It is quite, believable that that's something that they did.
Well,
but I don't have any evidence of that. That's all I can say.
Right. Well, here's the bigger question. It's just, what do we do now? Now, the fact of the matter is, I mean, Syria has been under so much pressure and strain and hardship. I mean, they had this civil war for what? How long did that last? 15 years or so? And all these sanctions, it's been attacked for a long time. It's been really tough for the people of Syria. And now we have this jihadist head chopper that's in charge. But
right.
Now Trump is saying we're going to lift sanctions on the country. And, do you know Daryl Cooper, right, from Martyr Made? And he has this show with Scott Horton called Provoked. It's a great show. And Daryl Cooper was just trying to push back at Scott Horton, saying like, well, it's awful that this guy's in charge. It's terrible. But what do we have to think if our goal is just like, what is the best for the Syrian people? If the sanctions are lifted, That's a good thing, right? We should be happy for that, even though it's under the rule of somebody that is pretty horrific. Should we try to get rid of this person and cause more chaos? Or is there a way that, okay, this extremist, but he is maybe slightly reformed? Like, what is the best way forward for the region and the people? Like,
Right.
can we try to, I mean, we obviously we want to put pressure and say you can't be persecuting these minority groups, you can't be killing, you got to get people under control.
Right.
But then we don't want the country to erupt into another civil war. It could be even more bloody. How do we move forward with this situation?
Right. No, I understand those points. Well, first of all, on the sanctions, okay, it was actually Trump declared that the sanctions had been lifted. Unfortunately, to actually make that permanent, Congress, the most severe sanctions were imposed by Congress, and only Congress has the authority to lift them. I think what Trump did was that he provided a 6 month waiver, something like that. And unfortunately, it's had virtually no effect so far, and it's not clear that it's going to have any significant effect. And one reason is that, well, first of all, the country is in such chaos. And the fact is that the government is still deprived of its oil revenues and deprived of again, its wheat growing regions. And then there's just the uncertainty about the sanctions themselves. Okay, there's a 6 month exemption, but then they get slammed again. So, outside investors or potential investors look at it and say, no, we're not going in there. Nothing's going to happen. So there's been very little relief, and there's really not much reason to believe that there's going to be any significant change in the economic condition of the country, unfortunately. And then, when you're talking about, if he could impose some kind of order, and even if it's rather cruel in some ways, if it could be better than the way things are now, or in some ways even better than the way they were under Assad, because the sanctions clearly had a crippling effect and really immiserated much of the population. And I think right now they say something like 95% of the population is living in poverty, really abject poverty, and they're desperate. So I can understand that. But again, we don't see real sanctions relief, and we don't see a real, any peace, any sign of peace. And I don't think we have any reason to believe that we're going to see it. And the reason is that, the country is Balkanized, and a very powerful force wants it to remain Balkanized, and that is Israel. I mean, they're completely in favor of a Balkanized Syria. That's a weak Syria. That's a Syria that can never present a threat to them. I think this is what they've always hoped for, and this is what they've achieved. So you have a very interesting, an apparent contradiction. It's just that the Israeli government has actually been overall, very happy about the takeover. They like the fact that al-Shura is now in charge, right? And al-Shura has been bending over backwards to please the Israelis. Israelis move in and they take over very valuable territory, the highest points in Syria, the most important watershed in Syria. And he hardly complains at all. It's just Israel can do no wrong, apparently, in his eyes. And now there's talk about some sort of a possibility of an Abraham Accord between Syria and Israel, that they actually would establish normal diplomatic relations at some point. And that's a real possibility. But why is it that Israel likes them in charge? Because they know with this Sunni extremist in charge, this is part of a long-standing Israeli policy. They're in favor of sectarian conflict. They understand that weakens their opponents. Assad held people together in Syria, but al-Shura, is going to divide them and is dividing them, and they can take advantage of that. And so we've seen them take advantage of that in establishing these ties with the Druze. He sends his thugs down south to ethnically cleanse Druze, or to teach them a lesson, to subjugate them. The Israelis intervene and help. They bomb the convoys that are heading south to protect the Druze, and the Druze are thankful. They're desperate. They're faced with ethnic cleansing or maybe even worse. And the one, power that actually is protecting them is Israel. So now there were always some, let's say, Israel-leaning elements within the Jewish community, but there were others that were very strongly opposed to Israel. I remember that from, a trip we made in 2011 to Palestine. Met some of those very pro-Syrian, pro-Assad Jewish people. But, clearly but it's, to put it very mildly, Israel has leverage, here. They have, these people are desperate and they can pose as protectors and they can establish this relationship with them. And through that relationship, they can help to Balkanize Syria. They can create some kind of a Israeli-controlled statelet in the south. Now, what's happening in the other sections, again, the Shia are under attack. The Alawites are under attack. The Kurds will be, the Christians are. And what is Israel doing? They're reaching out to influencers in all those different communities and paying them to say, Israel is our protector. And, we need to stand by Israel. So this is happening.
How do you know that Israel is paying for this?
Okay, well, this comes from Kevork Almassian, and he has a very interesting story to tell. He has, again, a lot of connections, and this is what he's hearing, is that this has been going on. And you can see it on social media. These influencers are coming in, but there's Israel is, and to a great extent, behind it. And he's had personal experience again. It's just that he was approached by an Israeli businessman who said, you've got this great show here. Why can't you do something to help out like your fellow Armenians in Syria? I'll pay you. And he didn't name the sum, but I'm sure it was quite significant to do this. And he said, no, get out of here. He asked, he claimed that he had no connection with the Israeli government, but then he kept on kind of slipping into a we want this, we want that. And he would ask, hey, who's this we? And he said, oh, no, it's just me. But this wasn't the first time. He's been approached several times to do this. He personally, and he's always refused. But a lot of people, you have to understand, are really desperate. Some people don't have the strong political understanding, others, maybe are morally weak, but all of them, within Syria are in a state of desperation,
right,
on the verge of starvation. And so, and so they say, okay,
family,
right.
Money could get you out of there, save your family. I can see how many people would fall
right.
for it. If you're
so this is happening on a mass scale. So you have Israel, with the openly friendly relations, or or maybe not openly friendly, but much improved relations with the Syrian government. They're happy to see this guy in charge. At the same time, they're working to undermine him, in a sense, because this is the thing. Yeah, great. Have this Sunni extremist in charge. He helps us out. Now all these other people are desperate. We go to them and we pose as their protector. And maybe they really do protect him for a while, to achieve certain ends. And then another thing is, again, within the Sunni population, you have, a lot of these people were supporters of Assad. The moderate Sunnis in general were. It was just this extremist element, that wanted to see him overthrown within Syria. But now you have increasingly, a radicalization within the Sunni community. So more of them are gravitating towards the extremists. So, overall, you see a country that's, is no longer a country. It has fallen apart. And it very much according to, Israel's playbook. That's the unfortunate truth. The U.S. wants to have, or, says, I think it does. In fact, there's Tom Barak, who's kind of the envoy to Lebanon, who's saying they're trying to work something out where, again, the al-Shara government could gain control over Syria, and it could have a unified Syria. And then, the idea is that it would be friendly with the U.S. and Israel. But he said openly, Israel doesn't want that. He actually said, that we're talking about the American representative, that they want to Balkanize Syria. And it's clear they do. And I'm afraid that's where Syria is, and that's where it's going to be for the foreseeable future.
Ooh, and so devious, but It seems to be successful in a short time. They are balkanizing it. They have destroyed Syria, weakened it. It's no longer a threat to Israel. But I just feel like the long-term plan of either making the whole Middle East subservient to you or balkanizing it is just the arrogance behind that type of strategy is insane. Like you can't. That's not a long-term winning strategy, right? I mean, that it's impossible. You can't subjugate the whole region forever. And you've gone this far, you have no choice but to continue subjugation, balkanization, subservience, right? You can't do that in perpetuity, right? Indefinitely, right?
Right. You wouldn't think so. You'd have to say that they've actually been rather successful,
No,
within their
incredibly
immediate neighbor.
successful.
Right.
But that's why
in the
they
end, I mean, there are, right. You're going to sow so much hatred as it's just in the end, you'll reap the whirlwind.
right.
You know,
Right. And you now have chosen this path. I don't think you can go to a different path. Once you've made this much destructions and put so much into subjugating and bribing people off and everything, like you can't just turn around and be like, let's normalize relations, be a regular person and a regular country in the region, and and then all of a sudden people will love Israel. Like it's impossible now.
Yeah.
You have chosen the path to rule through fear and death and destruction and corruption. That's
Right.
that's a recipe for your own destruction. Everybody knows that.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's kind of like, you have your foot on somebody's neck, and you've kept it there for a long time, and you've been, whipping them or, abusing them. Well, at that point you say, well, should I take my foot off his neck? It's probably not. It would be a bad idea because he's going to leap to his feet.
But you can't keep it there forever.
Right.
You can't keep it there forever. Like that's crazy.
And in a way, you can say that that's what happened on October 7th. Again, everybody in the West pretends to know or doesn't know. They're ignorant about it. But just the sadistic treatment of Gaza prior to that, it was in essence, eventually this is, you are creating so much hatred and sense of desperation, that these people will lash out at you and you'll suffer real harm.
Right. Yeah, and I know with the October 7th thing, we don't know what exactly happened.
Yeah,
but
right.
The possibility of a stand-down order and that there was knowledge and allowing it to happen, I think is very real. And
this is a possibility. Yeah, I admit that. But then also that even if it wasn't, the crimes that are attributed to Hamas are greatly exaggerated. I think there's no question about that. We forget that the primary targets were military, and then there's the whole question about the Hannibal Directive, and it was clear that a lot of the casualties were in fact caused by the IDF. We don't know the number, but it could very well run into the hundreds. So anyway, yeah, but even if you kind of accept the mainstream story, that no matter what, you need to just understand the context, what came before. It was sort of like a case of the Israelis having their foot on the neck of the Gazans for such a long time. And then one day, they looked the other way, and then Gaza was able to leap to its feet and strike back. And that's the problem with that policy, right? It's just that you create so much hatred that the other side, their willingness to, they will seek vengeance. And at some point, I think it's inevitable that they'll have it.
Yeah, I think what started on October 7th can't be bottled up anymore. It's not going to just end and be like it was before. That was a pivotal moment, October 7th, and what unfolded since. I think, what do you think is next for Israel? Its next move? It seems like they're already supposed to be moving to phase 2, but already Israel's like, there's some snags. I don't think we can do it. And whether they've been bombing the hell out of Lebanon as well. Do you think that we're just going to see just sort of the slow encroachment until there's another big flare up, and then we'll see if a full on war gets started?
Yeah. Well, we see some of that slow encroachment already within Lebanon. The Lebanese government is saying that the Israelis are building a wall, and the wall is not on the international boundary. Again, it's like we talked about the wall in the West Bank, that in general does not follow the Green Line. They built a wall as a way of just taking, carving out more pieces of west, there's Palestinian territory, and then up north, now they're doing it to Lebanon. It's just constantly chipping away, expanding incrementally. Now in Gaza, of course, we have the yellow line, and I think there's a real chance that that'll become the new wall. And so, there it's not quite so incremental. They've taken more than half of Gaza. But there are pressures, I think they may revert to an incremental strategy for a while, consolidate before, they unleash new attacks on Gaza or elsewhere. But there is this constant pressure, again, from the right wing, which is increasingly powerful in Israel, not to slow down, to continue, to finish the job in Gaza, for example.
Do you think what's happening here domestically between this MAGA civil war, the sort of the Israeli first, the Zionist within the Republican coalition versus the America Firsters, do you think that this will have an impact on Israel's calculus? Like what's happening right now?
You think it would. Again, Netanyahu declared that was the Eighth Front. And I think he understands, and a lot of Israelis understand, if they fail on the Eighth Front, they're going to fail on all the other 7 fronts. Because they're all dependent on the U.S., or rather Israel is entirely dependent on U.S. support. So it would be hard to believe that they're not taking that into account. Now, do they feel, confident that they can deal with it? That again, we see the kind of moves that they're making. They don't seem to be very successful. And that's something that we've talked about. It seems like they're bound to lose on the Eighth Front, but maybe they just have this hubris, this supreme confidence, we always win. That seems to still be there. And they may not really understand the danger that they're in.
Yeah, I don't want to underestimate them either. I don't think they can win this narrative, but they're trying pretty hard. I feel like my X feed has really changed the past couple of days, and you saw what happened with Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene, how Trump just threw them both under the bus and is full on with the Lindsey Graham, Mark Levin camp. Let me actually just to get, I don't know if you read the exact tweet from Trump, but let me just read what he said about Thomas Massie. He said, "Did Thomas Massie get married already? Boy, that was quick. No wonder the polls have him at less than an 8% chance of winning the election. Anyway, have a great life, Thomas, and ? His wife will soon find out that she's stuck with a loser." It's so crazy seeing this type of language from him. I mean, we're talking about Trump, somebody that's banging porn stars, cheats on his wife. It looks like he's somewhere in the Epstein files with something, who knows? And he talks to somebody that's been, a true America First person that's always positioned himself as America First and is pushing to get the release of the Epstein files. And you kind of wonder, is this why he's going after him so hard? And his wife, he was with her for over 30 years, and she died over a year ago. And it wasn't an uncommon amount of time. It was normal. It's just crazy. So I just think that type of rhetoric, I think, is really just completely split his base. He has, I don't know why he chose to engage in this type of language. He did the same thing with Marjorie Taylor Greene. Marjorie Taylor Greene pushing really hard for on this Epstein stuff, and she's been going on to some left-wing media, CNN, The View, and I think it's good. She's trying to bridge the gap and saying, like, we're in this together. We're Americans. We need to hold accountability. All this stuff, and then he
and she's gone after the Zionists too in a big way. Right.
She's gone after. She's been very strong. And this is clearly why she's being attacked. So people understand. That why are Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene, the two people that are really true America First, people that are saying things that resonate with the base, the anti-war party, saying, like, why are we sending all this money overseas to fund these wars? Why are we doing things that are not in our own interest? Why are we funding this genocide? And he's coming after them so hard. So I think for so many people that maybe were on the fence, now they understand. They see what's going on. Or the people that are saying, like, hey, Trump is really Israel first, they probably feel vindicated from this type of these responses. So I just feel like Trump, is he now a lame duck president? I mean, the base is gone, right? Or it's completely fractured. It's completely split in half now.
Yeah. I don't know if it's split in half. I haven't seen any polls. I think we might be surprised by how many people are just
I know
Trump
there's a
loyalists.
lot. Sometimes I think
And
it's
so
just people that are paid
but
off.
he clearly has been hurt by this because these people are important. Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Thomas Massie. A lot of people
Candace
listen to
Owens.
him, and they will have, they're having an effect now, and they will continue to have effect. They a lot of some of the pro-Trump fanatics, maybe a good number of them, will never. It doesn't matter, what happens. They'll never cease to believe in Trump. But others will, and I think over time, again, when he loses these very important voices, he's going to lose a portion of his base, and he just can't afford to do that. I don't think he can at all. But it doesn't surprise me. That's just Trump's personality. He just can't take criticism. He really can't. And you saw it in the first term. I remember one of his strongest supporters was Ann Coulter, the anti-immigration firebrand. And because she held him accountable to his promises. He said he was going to build this wall. That was a big part of his campaign, right? There were chants at rallies, build the wall, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it didn't happen. And Ann Coulter just kept on saying, he would mock him, how much of the wall has been built, today or last week or whatever. She would not let go. She was just like a attack dog that had teeth in his, she would not let go. And he was furious, and he went after her and started calling her names and so on and so forth. He didn't respond by saying, "I'm sorry, yeah, we got to do this. We're going to work harder on this." It just said, "Okay, yeah, we just must destroy Ann Coulter." That's the way he responds to these things.
Yeah, well, is he really going to be severely damaged, like you said, from this, or does it really matter? It's his last term, and when you look at the leaders in the Western world, I mean, we talk about people like Merz and Macron and Starmer. They're all just hovering around 15% approval rating. So it's like, right. Hey, this is where you're supposed to be. Yeah, just come on here. It doesn't matter if you're hated. You can still do whatever the hell you want to do. You know. So do you think it really matters, or it's if he wants to just start wars, he just he can just start wars. He doesn't care what people thinks about him. He's just going to do whatever he wants to do.
I think he does care. Actually, he
cares about the people right next to him.
Yeah. Okay. That seems to be true. That seems to be true of a lot of politicians, actually. Unfortunately, they listen to the people that within their social circles, the people that surround them, who make themselves their friends. That's unfortunately true. I guess that's the swamp. But it does matter. It does constrain. If he loses the House, and he will in a big way, that's going to hurt him. If he loses part of his base, it just means that he just has less room for maneuver. But still, he can do a lot of things. He's the president. He can sign executive orders, and he can tweet, and people will pay attention to what he says. And perhaps he doesn't care. I think he cares to some extent, but he's just made the calculation that. I don't know if he's even making a calculation, actually. Like I say, I think it's just his personality. He's just reacting emotionally. You read these tweets, and it doesn't seem like somebody's actually calculating anything, but just like the emotional response of a overexcited 7-year-old boy or something.
Yeah, let's see if these Epstein files get released, because it seems like he's going after them hard because of them pushing for the release of the Epstein stuff. And, we talked about Epstein a little bit on Friday, and something that people brought up in the comments. It's it's not necessarily just all about pedophilia and blackmail with it. It's also just the financial crimes that maybe so many of these people will be implicated in, because it seems like that's a lot of what Jeffrey Epstein did, was moving money around for things that shouldn't have been able to move money around for. So maybe it's more of that stuff.
Quite possibly.
Yeah, but what we'll see. I mean, I just hope it comes out. I also heard that, there's talk about doing an investigation, but almost to do an investigation to stop the release of the files. It seems like they're just going to do whatever they can to stop it. But the more they try to stop it, the more we know, right?
Yeah.
The more of that people will just say all right, well, I'm just going to just have to assume it's true, because you're doing everything in your power to not get them released. It's just it's a crazy time. So we have that situation going on. that just sort of underpins all these huge other geopolitical conflicts that you just have to keep in the back of your mind. Like, and also there's a fact that maybe there's some, a real compromising material that's blackmailing a lot of people. That might also cause some escalations in these wars and to do things that are not in our national interest.
Right. Or just the fact that he's weak and will perhaps make it more difficult, for example, to implement his 20-point plan for Gaza. He's going to be weakened vis-a-vis Netanyahu. And I think Netanyahu is eventually going to get his way. I mean, he seems like he always does, but it'll just come all the sooner because of this.
Yeah, politics, it's a nasty game. Well, let's move over to Ukraine. Seems like things are not looking good there. So maybe you can start by giving us an update on the front line.
Okay. Well, Pokrovsk, continues. It is a cauldron. The remaining Ukrainian soldiers are hunkered down in northern Mirnograd. That's where they are now. And the cauldron is actually tightened. For a while there was a corridor, but it was basically a killing zone corridor. Some may have escaped during, when the fog arrived. That has actually changed things. The Russians were able to move in a lot of forces under the cover of fog, but perhaps some Ukrainian soldiers managed to sneak out. I think probably they did. But since then, it's snapped shut, and there's simply no way out. So that's what's happening across. Clearly, it's basically over. It's just going to be a matter of time before the remaining soldiers in Minograd are killed or surrender. And, it probably in past wars, it would already be over. They can't get any supplies, but they can still get a certain number of supplies. They're just supplied via drones, in particular the Baba Yaga drones. And some of those get through, but clearly that's not sufficient. That's not going to be able to allow them to actually hold out for a significant length of time. So it's going to be soon. It's coming to an end. The most dramatic developments are taking place south, again along that Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk boundary, where the Russians are just moving very rapidly, and there's just no sign that they're slowing down, which I find very interesting. It's because, in fact, they're moving more rapidly there than I think they have any time since 2022. Everybody agrees that. And the Ukrainians are admitting it too. It's just, every day it's just a couple more villages, another 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers. They're just, they're unstoppable there. And why is that? Well, first of all, the Ukrainians had built lines of fortification there, but they had been expecting an attack from the south. So these trenches actually run east-west, and the Russians are coming, from the east. So, when you're going, so in that case, obviously the trenches don't do any good. And that's part of the problem. But you would think that, we've seen breakouts like this before. Remember back in August, there was that breakout north of Pokrovsk, where all of a sudden, the Russians moved like roughly 10 kilometers in a day, and then they took up, a good chunk of territory up there. But the Ukrainians responded. They panicked, that this is, we've got to stop them. This could be the unraveling of the whole line. So they sent elite forces there and checked the advance. So they started launching a series of counterattacks. Have continued up until very recently. Now the Russians were able to hold onto that territory, but they weren't able to continue. But down there in the south, we see them continue. That tells me that the Ukrainians have not sent, any significant reinforcements. In fact, we've heard recently they pulled some off from there. So what's going on? They just don't have them. I think at this point it's clear this is a true crisis. There are a lot of Ukrainians that are ringing the alarm bells, and they've been doing it now for some weeks, but nobody has come because they don't have them. That's to me, that's the only explanation, which tells you, they're in serious trouble. We could look back and say this was the beginning of the end. This was the collapse, and maybe we'll see. Can they pull something off? I don't know. It may be that the whole line will begin to unravel from this point. It's another thing, just looking at this, I was, this is taking place. There are also some advances taking place further south, like the Russians moved out of Robotyne, which is where it was a tiny little town, but it was very much in the news in 2023 because that's where that was as far as the Ukrainians got during their 2023 summer offensive. They got to Robotyne, which was just north of the Syrovikin line, the first of the Syrovikin lines, if you recall. And they fought and they fought and fought. There was this tiny little village. Apparently, according to the plans, they were supposed to get it within the first day or the very first few days. They spent the whole summer and into the fall trying to get it, and eventually, gave up. They were defeated. And now, the Russians took it back, and now they're advancing actually north from there. They've taken the next town was Tokshmaya, I think, or Tokshm. I can't remember the name exactly. But anyway, they've continued north from there. And just looking at it, I say, well, wait a second. It's like the Russians in preparation for this advance, they constructed these lines. It turned out they didn't really even need them. And then the minefields ahead of them and all that, they were prepared. And these lines were clearly impenetrable. In the end, I think maybe on one or two occasions they managed to just barely contact the first line. Now the Ukrainians have had, this is 2 years since that summer offensive, and they dug some trenches running east-west that turned out to be even oriented the long way. They didn't do anything. What is this? How do you explain this? Is it just incompetence? Is it just a lack of resources? But in any case, it's obviously a huge failure on the part of the Ukrainians, and they are suffering the consequences now.
Well, unless NATO sends troops, then this war is basically over then, right? Because you're saying they don't have men, and that's why we have these rapid advances.
Right.
It looks like they don't have men. They're having trouble force conscripting. We know that it seems like the desertions are outnumbering the force conscription rate, right? So it's just, and you have all these deaths. It doesn't matter how much weapons or money you send to Ukraine. If there's nobody in these trenches, nobody to use the weapons and the money, then it doesn't matter, right? So are we at this point where NATO needs to make a decision? Are you sending bodies?
Yeah. NATO isn't going to do that. Well,
then it's over.
But yeah, well, I think, clearly the war, Ukraine is going to lose the war. That's true. I guess I would just say, okay, there is still a long ways for the Russians to go and some very, very difficult obstacles that they have to overcome. Again, Zaporozhye is a very large city. I think it's 700,000. And they do have to cross the Dnieper. That's going to be a big challenge. So these things do remain. They are. So it still may be some time, but who knows? If it looks like like I say, that we are seeing the unraveling of the line. It's not just actually, in the region that I pinpointed there, along the Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporozhye boundary there. But even right to the west of Pokrovsk, as we're watching the cauldron tighten, the encirclement tighten there around Minograd, the Russians are actually moving west already from Pokrovsk. And it just looks like, and we may see something similar happen there that we're seeing happening farther south. And maybe this is going to, it has that feeling about it. I guess I've just been, I'm reluctant to say, okay, yeah, it's the collapse has come again, because we have been surprised, and where we've expected in the past and it hasn't. But I think that it's looking more like a collapse than anything we've seen so far. Let's just put it that way. And then again, it appears that the Ukrainians just do not have the reserves. That's one thing they had before. Okay, they did suffer grievously in a lot of these battles, but they were able to plug the hole and then fight another day and force the Russians to, again, to proceed slowly and cautiously. We saw it, I mentioned the case of that breakout just north of Pokros. But we saw it, for example, after Avdiivka, there was a breakout where they went to Ocheretina, to the north. And, all of a sudden they moved very rapidly. It took the town, and it looked like there was going to be a huge breakout. And there were some significant advances. But the Ukrainians back then, they still had those reserves, and they sent them there, and they were managed to, again, they couldn't completely they could stabilize the lines for a while, and then, but of course, the Russians still were able to advance, but not rapidly, the way they had. They made the Russians, they made it into a slog, and it looks like they've lost that ability. So anyway, and if that's true, then it could be rapid. We could see the whole thing fall within a year, or, maybe even sooner. I think that's a possibility now. I'm cautious because this has gone on for so long, but it is looking like it. It looks like the writing is on the wall. Another thing that's happening, of course, is the fiscal crisis. They are running out of money, and the Americans have said that we're not paying for the weapons anymore. The Europeans have to buy them, but the Europeans just don't have the money. They don't.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they're talking about, again, stealing, and it's essentially stealing. It's not just it's really stealing the money from the Russians, and which is a very reckless, in the end, a very foolish move. But they're seriously considering, people like von der Leyen and Chancellor Merz, they want to do it. They clearly do. Why do they want to do it? It's because they don't see the alternative. And if they can't get that money, they just cannot get get enough money to Ukraine. So not only are they running out of men, they don't have the reserves, they're also running out of money. They're going to be running out of weapons. It does look really, really grim. It looks like we are really coming to the end, in spite of my caution, just the more you look at it, the more desperate the situation appears for Ukraine.
Yeah. They're running out of time. They're running out of money. They're running out of weapons. They're running out of men. It's just, you're right. I just don't understand. But the propaganda machine is still going strong. I see a lot of things like, oh man, Russia is really weak. These hits on the refineries, or their economy is collapsing. It's imploding right now. Just push a little bit harder. I saw Trump seems to be buying into that still. Because he's been going golfing with Lindsey Graham. This is who he hangs out with.
Right.
And so there's talk about these secondary sanctions. So I have a feeling that Trump lives in his own world. I really think what's happened with Trump is that the Zionists and the neocons really Truman showed the whole thing. They've created another reality that they inhabit, and he lives fully in there, and he's just disconnected with everything else. I mean, he has his own Truth Social platform to keep him in that bubble too, to just, I'm so great, everyone's great, and it's probably full of half of them are Zionists, are bots that in there, they're created by the neocons and the Zionists anyways, just to feed his ego. But it sounds like he's going to escalate. I don't see him backing away from this. It seems like he's made his mind, and he's angry at Putin, and he wants to do these sanctions. What do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, well, that seems to be the course that he's on. And again, I think that's his personality. I think he really did want to make a deal. But the thing is that he didn't bother to really understand the conflict and to work out a strategy. That's the thing, is sometimes he does have some healthy instincts, and they're reflected in certain comments that he makes, but he just does not have the discipline to sit down and fully understand the situation, work out a strategy and carry it out. And that's what he had to do. And he never did it. Even if he had done that, even if he was like the most disciplined and far-seeing leader that we've ever had, it would have been a difficult fight, because clearly you have the entire deep state against you. And the Europeans and everything. It would have been difficult, very, very difficult. And it's not clear that he could have succeeded even then. But in the end, it wasn't even a fight. It's just because he just goes at these things in such a kind of an impulsive way, right? It's just like, yeah, just call and we'll get together and we'll work something out. And I'll say, yeah. And then that's not sufficient. You have to put together a team. You have to be disciplined. You got to stay on message, and that's just something he doesn't. He himself doesn't stay on his own message. It just was never going to work out. And so, yeah, the swamp was always there. The deep state was always there, and they did take some blows from him in the first few months of his administration, but they didn't go away. They didn't lose the battle, and they just have patiently, reestablished themselves. And then I think that it looks like, yeah, he's firmly within their grasp now, under their control.
So what do you see him doing, though? I mean, these sanctions we've been talking about, these secondary sanctions, it seems like it's going to backfire, right? I mean, China and India aren't going to go along with this, and it's just going to make us look even weaker and, maybe drive the price of oil up and hurt a few countries. But anything else you think, like tomahawks or other missiles, like do you think there's any chance of escalating on the military side?
I think there is. For the time being, it looks like they've pulled back on the tomahawks. But that's just for the time being. We're talking about the unraveling of the front. And if this becomes just glaringly obvious, it's still at the stage where, the narrative can ignore it. But at some point, they will not be able to ignore it. And it'll just be glaringly obvious that it's curtains for Ukraine. And when that happens and people start talking about, oh, no, we have another Afghanistan, I think that's when Trump may react in a very, very dangerous manner. It's just like he may go to tomahawks and he may actually consider troops on the ground and all there a no-fly zone or something. Hopefully he'll be talked out of it. And people will explain to him it just doesn't work. But there will be the crazies around him who would say, you got to do that. You got to be tough. And he may listen to them.
Okay. Well, how far do you think that Russia will go? I mean, and adds the further they go and the quicker they go, the more likely of some reckless behavior from Trump and NATO, right?
Yeah.
So,
well, again, they have committed themselves to those 4 oblasts. But I think they have a very strong incentive, once they take them. And I think, once they take them, probably Putin will just make one final offer, say, look, we did this, remember our deal. Here we actually have them. Okay, are you going to accept our deal now, our offer? And the answer will be no. And at that point, I think he'll go on. And I think, he himself has hinted at it, that they are going to go west from Kherson and take Nikolaev and Odessa and go all the way to Transnistria, because there are very good strategic reasons to doing that. They say if you can't get some kind of deal, then you just have to ensure that Ukraine can never present the threat, a significant threat again. And the best way of doing that is actually to take that southern territory, because it cuts them off from the Black Sea. One thing that happened, it was one of the reasons I think why the SMO was launched, why the war broke out in 2022, was that the NATO was actually working, starting to modify the ports on the Black Sea in that area. There were obviously plans to establish NATO naval bases there. And that was, very alarming for the Russians for very good reasons. And, I think so just looking at it, say, if we can't get a promise, and I don't know what a promise would really be worth, but Putin has a soft place for, these kind of promises. If we can't get some sort of assurance, an ironclad assurance from the West that they won't do this, we simply have to take the territory. And I think there's no question if, again, they fail to get that assurance, they fail to get a treaty, they are going to move into that area and take all of southern Ukraine, along the coast there. And then probably they've already made very significant inroads into Kharkov, and they'll continue that. And they may go all the way to Kharkov City. Again, that's a very large city. We're talking, it's the second largest in Ukraine, I believe 1.4 million. That would be major. But perhaps at that point, the Ukrainians will be so weak that it won't be very hard for them to take it. Yeah.
How badly has this corruption scandal rocked the Ukraine support? You know, the support for the Ukraine war. Has it really been really damaging to Zelensky and just its supporters?
Oh, yeah, no, it clearly has. It is. These are people very, very close to Zelensky. You know, we've talked about Mindich. There's somebody that goes way back, back to his comedy days and rose together with them, and is obviously a very close friend and associate. So everybody looks at that, and I think everyone in Ukraine is thinking that Zelensky had to know he was part of this. It hurts him. There's no question about that. But I don't think, at least it could lead to his downfall, but I don't see it as imminent at all because you just don't see anybody to replace him. And I think that there are a lot many people or many different factions in the West would like to see him go, but they don't really have a replacement for him. Maybe they can find somebody who's just maybe a little less corrupt, maybe a little more willing to listen, to a little more realistic when it comes to military matters. But it's not even clear who that is. Maybe Zelensky would be preferable, but it's not going to be a major difference. And right now, it's just that in spite of this, recent scandal, Zelensky does still have a very, very firm grip on power. He's worked at, getting all of his opponents, he's either jailed them or exiled them, like in the case of Zelensky, and then he's gone after their associates and some cases even their family members. And so he is in charge weakened, but he's still very much in charge.
I just imagine that there's so many people then in Europe that maybe were sort of tacit supporters of the Ukraine war. When they start to see these corruption scandals and life is getting so hard for the everyday European that they become disenchanted with supporting the Ukraine war. It's like, wait, what? We always knew that there was some corruption issues, but then seeing it so blatant out here in the open, I imagine has to hurt his support throughout the rest of Europe.
Yeah, no, it does. And it certainly affects, I think, also, the leadership within Europe, because they've been sending them all this money and it's becoming increasingly difficult for them to do. Mm-hmm. And now, already they're saying, I don't think I can convince my electorate, or I can get away with sending another 5 billion euros or whatever it is for, the country in question. It's clearly very unpopular. It's going to be all the more unpopular when the opposition can point out, that the extent of the corruption in Ukraine. He's sending 5 billion. Well, are they going to take half of that? That's what people are going to say. And that's going to make it. So it's made things even harder for Ukraine as a result. There's no question about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Before we finish today, Dad, could we talk a little bit about China, Taiwan, Japan? It feels like there's an attempt to make Taiwan the next Ukraine. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, we've seen that go on for a while, actually under Biden. And I think Biden on 4 different occasions said that the U.S. would intervene if Taiwan, it would intervene militarily if Taiwan came under attack by mainland China. And that was a departure from previous American policy. We had what was called strategic ambiguity, a policy of strategic ambiguity, meaning that, okay, we're not going to say that we're going to intervene, but we're also not going to say that we won't intervene. We don't want to tie our hands, but we want the Chinese to think twice about it. And he broke it. And each time it was walked back, it's not clear it's just this was a function of his dementia or it was a true policy change. It's actually not entirely clear. Who knows in the case of Biden. But quite recently, the Prime Minister of Japan, was Takaichi, made a similar statement. She said that and this was a departure, if the PRC does move militarily against Taiwan, we will respond accordingly. We will respond militarily. And this provoked a furious response from the PRC. Now, and must be remembered that according to the PRC, and not just the PRC, according to the United States and the great majority of the world's governments, Taiwan is a part of China. and it just is a matter of time before it goes back. We all hope that it'll be peaceful, but it is Chinese territory. That is the understanding. That's something that our own government, acknowledged decades ago. And we have been actually departing from that, which much to the anger of the Chinese. And now we see the Japanese doing it too. So that's provoked this furious response. They're saying this is, clear, unwarranted intervention in our internal matters. And especially they're going to be furious when they talk about the Japanese because they still have very bitter memories of World War II. You say you're talking about intervening, going against us, sending your military against us like you did back in the 1930s, right? That's the way they look at it. And so not only did they, respond with some furious statements, but they actually advised all their citizens to avoid travel to Japan. And then they, because that's actually a very, very common destination for Chinese tourists and quite important to the tourism industry in Japan. And there were already, hundreds of thousands of Chinese had booked flights, had vacation plans. They were going to go to Japan. The Chinese government, instructed the different airlines to offer refunds. They're not
full refunds.
Yeah, full refunds. You say, okay, no matter what, up until the day before, your departure date, you can get a full refund. And and already many have taken advantage of that. So they're putting, some. It's not just a war of words, but they're actually now applying some economic pressure on Japan.
Right. We saw how China played with Trump and the tariffs, that they said, we're not playing games here. We're doing tit for tat. They responded forcefully right away. We haven't really seen how they would potentially respond militarily, but it seems like they're taking the same stance here. They responded very forcefully. They said Japan is playing with fire and it will be destroyed by the fire if he continues to do this. They don't mess around with this Taiwan issue. But it sounds like the Prime Minister Takaichi, she seems to be doubling down. I saw some talk about her saying about hosting foreign nuclear weapons in Japan, as a deterrent. I know within Japan, it's pretty divided. I think seems to be about half the population's like, whoa, this is got hot real quick. We don't want this. And then I see a lot of people that are very pro-Japan. And then same thing in Taiwan. We talked about this as well. Taiwan is also very divided. Something that I was talking with one of my buddies here, just about the Taiwanese here in America. They are very anti-China for the most part, the majority here. So if you as an American or somebody just living in the West, you meet Taiwanese people here, you just think that they're full of these people that just hate China and they want Taiwanese independence. But that's not the reality. I lived in Shanghai for 10 years. I worked with many Taiwanese people in China. Right. Just think about it. First of all, Taiwan is right there off the coast of China. China is this economic powerhouse now. There's a lot of opportunities. I went there for opportunity. These Chinese, the Taiwanese there, they speak Chinese. It's easier for them to travel here. They can get a Taibao work there, easy, free. There are so many Taiwanese that are doing business in China and working with China, and they have a completely different attitude. So we live in this bubble in the West. Right. I met a Russian person here. I told you I met somebody, and I was like, oh yeah, my sister lives in Moscow. Did not get the response I was expecting. They were like, oh my God, Russia's the most evil person ever. I was like, I thought you would be happy to know that I also know a little bit about your country. But you just have that here and then the West. Right. They're very part of the Western hegemonic system. But within Japan, within Taiwan, it's a diversity of opinions here. There's half of them are like the Western hegemony. The others like China. It's really much more complicated. Right. I don't know if I have a question here. Maybe you can just expound on that.
There clearly is a division, and it's playing out in the politics there. I think I mentioned in a previous episode, of course, the current ruling party is the Minjindang, which is the Democratic Progressive Party, and they are pro-independence, and they also are very tightly allied with Japan. That's something that actually angers a lot of Chinese, both in the PRC and within Taiwan, because a lot of the especially the Chinese that are descendants, like your mother, are children or grandchildren of those that came over with Chiang Kai-shek. They have very bitter memories of the Japanese. Now, some of the native Taiwanese don't have those memories because the 50 years that Taiwan was under Japanese rule, the colonial administration there in Taiwan was relatively enlightened. It was not like, what you found in China or in Korea. And, for whatever reason, maybe it was just the particular administrator or something. And so they don't have those same bitter memories, but those who, let's say both those who know the history well and those that, are descended from recent descendants, they're all descendants, basically virtually all of them are descendants of the Chinese, but those who are recent descendants do have these very bitter memories of the Japanese. So you do have the split. On the other side is the KMT, the Chiang Kai-shek's party. And they, of course, they were fiercely anti-communist, but they've always been pro-Chinese. And they still are. And so they are not at all happy. There's very fierce debates taking place in the parliament, in Taiwan about this. They're angry about these very pro-Japanese moves on the part of the current government. And I think when it looks like they will take power back from them, the KMT will take power back from the DPP in the next election. And when that happens, you'll find, have a policy that is much less hostile, that is open to negotiation with the mainland and will put distance between Taiwan and Japan. But for the present, you do have this very tight alliance between Taiwan and Japan.
Do we feel like this is just all rhetoric right now, or do you think there is a push to start some type of conflict? And is this a real flashpoint that we need to watch right now?
Well, we need to watch it. There's always a chance. I've been following Taiwan for decades, and I've been hearing, predictions that the mainland will invade and in 2 years or 5 years. Recently I've heard it's going to happen next year. So I just tend not to pay any attention to that. But there may be a day where it does happen. If the current government under Lai Ching-te, if they actually declare independence, that probably would trigger a military attack on Taiwan.
I think it almost certainly would.
Yeah,
China
almost
is
certainly
very
would.
serious about this.
Yeah, I think it will attack. It may mean that what they may do is enforce an economic blockade, which is very much within their power. And Taiwan is a country that, or I shouldn't say a country, a region, looking at is under, it is entirely dependent on international trade. It just cannot last long. They cannot feed their own population, without that international trade. So if an economic blockade is imposed on them, I think they'll have to surrender pretty quickly if the U.S. doesn't become involved, but that would just be disastrous. The U.S. and Japan, that would be disastrous in the end. I think no matter what the Chinese would lose, but it could be a major war with always the risk of going nuclear.
Yeah, maybe it's just me and that I'm too much online in my little doom scrolling world with the news. I understand that, but it feels like the China war hawks are brewing. It feels like something big is just brewing, just all over. The increasing the desperation now in Ukraine, going with Venezuela. I don't know. There's talk about maybe Maduro will make some type of deal with Trump. We'll see, but I just feel like we're on this hair trigger of potentially an all-out war. And maybe I'm just, like I said, in my own little world, but that's how I'm feeling that a bit. I'm feeling that energy out there right now. All these war hawks, they're full blast, and I can see that engine starting to rev.
Yeah, well, there is also, I think, signs of a growing realism, and we hope that becomes the dominant trend. There was a Rand paper that came out recently, and it essentially was an acknowledgement that we cannot defeat China, and that China is here to stay. They will be they are a superpower, and they will remain one. We cannot keep them down, and we're just going to have to live with the fact. And that's a real, it was a change in, this is, ran very close to the intelligence community, and it was a real change of tone. So there are voices of realism, and let's just hope that they win out. That's all I can say.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I hope so. I mean, it's just so suicidal to think about a war with China. I mean, and off their coast. I mean, you're kidding me. Yeah, and they produce everything. Like they could just sink the whole U.S. fleet if it comes anywhere near. Like with their hypersonic missiles, we can't stop that. It's just insane. They just send over 10 million drones. I just can't believe it's even under consideration. But I have been seeing these Chinese war hawks piping up a lot more recently, and it just it just makes me think like, my God, where are we headed? And just with the backdrop of the Epstein stuff, the corruption. This just makes. I think it's just such a wild card that's thrown into the whole mix. We don't really know what might happen because self-preservation is a powerful thing. And if there's very powerful people that want to just do whatever they can to save their own skin, their legacy, their reputation.
Right. Yeah. Well, you think of, again, we've talked about Netanyahu and Israel and how domestic politics really tends to drive him to always, I think he has this instinct already, but it's reinforced, an instinct to resort to the military option. But that instinct is reinforced by the domestic political pressures that he's under. And in the U.S., we have a president who is volatile, like I said, has a very inflated sense of himself. And he is under a lot of domestic pressures. It's not just Epstein, but just, overall, his approval ratings have been dropping. Maybe he'll join the sub 20% club with all his buddies in Europe. He's not there yet, but he's heading in that direction. And again, these leaders, they often look at wars as a way out. That's one of the reasons that wars begin sometimes. And so it is something to keep an eye on and something to be concerned about.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's end it there.
Okay.
Let's hoping for a day when there's not a lot to talk about. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. So.
No.
Okay. All right, Dad. Thanks a bunch. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.